You are presenting together with Erik Joris Hamlet Encounters. This is a special VR installation. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, it's indeed a project in which we try to find out what we can do with new technologies in the live performance. And in the case of Hamlet Encounters, the technologies we are talking about are virtual reality and motion capture. And we try to combine these technologies and try to find out what you can do with it. And what you can do with it is also part of our approach, in the sense that we are very keen at trying to find out what we can do with media and what the media do with us. So how the media redefine our senses, how they play our senses, and how we can make these media also playful in the way we use them for all kinds of purposes.
And why do you use Hamlet for this special purpose?
Well, you can use Hamlet for many things. It's a very rich play, but we were in particular fascinated by this play if you take into consideration that the play is very much about a transition from the Middle Ages to the modern world. And now in the 21st century we are also going through a kind of transition in time. In particular in the Western world, in which we aren't so sure anymore if, so to say, the ideals of the Enlightenment are still valid for how we consider our culture and society. So are we in the transition from the 20th to the 21st century also in a kind of transition? And could it be related to the years around 1600? So yes.
Actually, now this is a more technical question, but can you share with us some challenges by how to adapt Hamlet to this special VR experience?
Yes, there are many challenges. I mean, it's also, of course, related to, you asked, what can you do with Hamlet? We take Hamlet as a play in which there is not only this specific scene in which it is a play in a play, but we actually consider the whole Hamlet play as directed by Hamlet. So Hamlet is not the one who all the time doubts, as rather wonders, what are the effects of how I specifically behave and decide to do so, and reflect on the implications and consequences. So the most important parts in the play are actually the soliloquies, where it's reflecting on what has happened or might happen. And that's what we actually took as a starting point. So how can you use the technologies in such a way that you construct all kinds of universes or possible worlds in order to find out how they might relate to one another?
Now that you mentioned possible worlds, do you think that VR has a future? I mean, there are many bad thoughts about the VR's future, but do you think that VR will find its own story or its right format, a narrative or something else? Yeah,
but I think yes. But I think we should stop talking only in terms of narrative and stories. I think that the new technologies we are talking about, with which we play, with which we perform, with which we participate, are way much more about making worlds as telling stories in a more traditional sense. Even if you use all kinds of contradictory terms like non-linear storytelling and that kind of things. So we are actually in how we play, perform and participate with these tools, constructing in all kinds of ways new experiences and all kinds of worlds. And the VR technology is so far mainly considered as a kind of new form of cinema, which goes one step further, so you're not longer the disappearing invisible witness like in mainstream film that is allowed to be everywhere in order to understand what the film is all about, but you're actually in the center of it. But of course you pay also a price for it, because the first thing you notice in a virtual space is, hey, wait a minute, where is my body? Where am I? Whereas at the same time you immediately sense how your eyes and ears maybe also are redefined, that you all the time have to find out with your physical body how to relate to it. So the new technology very much learns us about all kinds of basics of perception, and you can, for instance, play with the tension between the only thing we can do with our eyes and ears, with the senses, is to observe distinctions, whereas at the same time, in order to relate to what we perceive, we have in one way or the other to synchronize. Mm-hmm. And that tension can be used also in a dramaturgical sense in order to find out how the transition in this world, as we observe it, could make it in a very corporeal sense also experienceable, how we relate to the things that are happening. But as long as you stay within the paradigm of the technology is mainly for the sake of creating a perfect illusion, I would say, well, yes, look at the holodeck in Star Trek. And if you strive, I mean, if you just consider the technology for the sake of illusion, I think that's the less interesting option you can go, the less interesting direction you can go into, so to say.
You mentioned that you think like VR is learning more from the cinematic media, or because
well, it's in that sense so much an alternative. I mean, cinematography is all about framing, is all about perspective, is all about changing distance and perspective, is all about the movement in the image and the movement of the image. And what in case you all of a sudden give all this up and put the spectator or the immersant or the experience or how you would like to call him in the center of that world. So there is a real friction, and it doesn't make sense to take all the time cinema as a starting point for reflecting on what you can do with virtual reality. And we used to think of the digitalization of our culture and society as a kind of dematerialization. And so the digital is not, you can't touch it, so to say. So, whereas I think that the most interesting thing that we can learn from these technologies, to what extent experiences can be really rooted and related to your own body.
This has something to do with liveness, no?
Absolutely, yes. And of course you all the time have to negotiate when you use these technologies in the live performance, how you deal with the live performance of the actual event as it takes place in the here and now, and where you use the technology for the sake of bridging the gap with a place somewhere else, like in the case of a teleperformance, or how you use the technology by creating a kind of friction between the virtual space and at the same time you stay in one way or the other still in the physical space, although your body seems to be disappeared, and so on and so forth. So for instance, I was last year at a conference about choreography and VR. And so if you give the VR technology to choreographers, who all the time start their whole thinking from the physical body, what can you do with the tool if the body disappears? And all the projects I've seen from them are actually, how can I deal with the fact that the body has disappeared? And almost all the attempts were, in one way or other, seek a kind of alternative for this, or still make the body appear in the virtual space.
But it's also on the side of creators. I recently read an interview with the director of the Stray Dogs, the movie, and he was directing a 360-degree movie last year, and it was presented at Venice Biennale, and he mentioned that it was like directing a theater performance, because like...
Yes, of course, but that very much relates to the specific conditions under which something is made, so that you really have to do it all in one take, or that kind of things, or that it all needs to be done in the here and now. But what is it that I wanted to say? I've lost my point a bit.
But we can anyway make this interview more
Yeah.
We are now here at Cluj at Intermediality Now conference.
Yeah.
How do you see the concept of intermediality from the framework of theater and performance today?
Yeah, so intermediality is, very much an experience of all of us living in a highly mediatized culture and society, all the time negotiating with different media, using them for all kinds of purposes. I prefer to start from the concepts of play, perform, and participate. So we use all these technologies for all these activities. And we are also more than ever aware that all these technologies and all these media are what they are and how they relate to one another. And so they are all make sense in network of media by which we are more and more surrounded. So in that sense, that's, I think, what's in itself already very relevant. Then with regard to the live performance, I think that the technologies are interesting in trying to find out how you can negotiate and deal with the fact that you have to structure time and space and maybe also in a way escape from the absolute presence of the here and now. There you can learn a lot from these technologies and where you can make them relevant. And as you will see also in the installation as we've made it in such a way that it's not the illusion, but it's actually also making visible how the illusion is created. So you can use the technologies are relevant for making all kinds of frictions, disruptions, create uncertainties about what you actually perceive, that you all the time have to negotiate with your body and see how you can relate to what you hear and what you see, that kind of things. So it's, as I said, the relevance is very much the way the technologies play our senses and how, in particular, theater as a kind of hypermedium provides an intermedial stage for the staging of these media. So not for just representing them, but also to stage them in such a way that they are not just used for creating worlds, but also to reflect on these technologies. Because in my view, the most interesting applications of these new technologies are those that actually learn us also about the specificity of the technologies.
Just the last question, because there are like many misunderstandings and there is basically a little chaos in the with the VR productions. There are certain people who are calling there are VR films, there are VR experiences you are referring as installation.
I noticed it as well. I mean, there are all kinds of, so what actually is virtual reality? And I make a very clear distinction between an omnidirectional video, in which, so to say, the space is more or less fixed as it is scanned and recorded, and also your position in that space is fixed. And in as far as you move through that space, that's the result of the recording in that space, but not specifically related to the navigating, moving body in that space. So you follow more or less the movement as it has been decided already by how it was recorded. Whereas in the case of a virtual space, you are in a digitally constructed world in which you really interact with your environment, in which you can walk around and, in the best case, also can do several things in order to make something happen. So yes, that's for me quite a fundamental difference. And the basic concepts that I use in order to find out how does virtual reality relate to 360 degrees video, how does it relate to film, or how does it relate to theater? And then you have to wonder, okay, how does the frame function? How does the distance function? How does the perspective function? And so on and so forth.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.